I should have knocked. I should have waited. But I didn't. And now I can't unsee it. The door to her room was slightly ajar, just enough for me to get a glimpse. It wasn't that I'd never seen her room before. We'd shared a house for years, both of us living under the same roof, sharing meals, the occasional awkward family gathering, and what felt like a never-ending parade of half-formed conversations. But today everything felt different. I didn't know it then, but I'd crossed a line that would change everything. I'd been expecting the usual. Her sprawled across the bed, phone in hand, scrolling through whatever teenage nonsense consumed her attention. Maybe a half-finished homework assignment left to the last minute. It was the kind of thing that would make anyone dismiss the scene as ordinary. But as I leaned in, curiosity clawing at me, everything shifted. The low hum of the TV drifted through the door. Her voice, soft but filled with something I couldn't quite place, made my heart stutter for a second. I wasn't supposed to be here, not in this moment, not at this hour, but there I was. The house was eerily quiet, everyone else asleep, and yet there was this pull, this strange, compelling urge to find out what she was up to. I didn't know what I was hoping for. Maybe nothing. Maybe just a glimpse of her without the usual veil of forced civility we wore in front of the family. But what I found was far beyond anything I'd expected. She was sitting on the bed, her back to the door, headphones in, lost in whatever world she was creating with the music. But it wasn't just her presence that held me there, frozen in place. It was the way she moved, the way the room felt like something was about to shift. My heart pounded harder when I noticed the shadows cast against the walls. They weren't the usual, innocent reflections of her belongings. No, these shadows. They didn't belong in a normal sister's room. For a second I thought I should turn back. The guilt pricked at me, the need to protect whatever was left of our relationship. But the air felt thick, charged in a way I didn't understand. I stepped closer, my footfall silent, almost as if my body knew I wasn't supposed to be here. And then, as if on cue, she shifted. The music stopped abruptly. The weight of the silence hit me like a freight train. Before I could even process what was happening, she turned her head sharply, her eyes locking with mine, wide with surprise. And that's when I saw it. More than I ever expected. In that moment I felt it all, the shock, the heat, the unsettling realization that I'd stepped into something I wasn't prepared for. My breath hitched in my chest, and I could barely process her stare as she slowly removed the headphones. The words didn't come right away. How could they? There was no script for this. The tension in the air felt unbearable, like we were both suspended in time, waiting for the other to make the first move. The familiar, predictable life we'd lived together. It was gone, just like that. And the worst part? I didn't know if I wanted to leave or if I wanted to stay. The silence that followed her sudden glance was suffocating. Neither of us moved at first. I could see her breathing change, chest rising and falling more rapidly now, her eyes darting between me and the floor. It was almost as if she was waiting for me to speak, but I couldn't. My mind raced, trying to piece together the fragmented image in front of me, trying to understand what I had just witnessed. There was something undeniable about the way the room felt. The air had thickened, and the space between us suddenly seemed far too small. I shifted my weight, about to turn away, but I didn't. I didn't know why. Something, maybe the unease, maybe the curiosity, kept me rooted in place, my eyes unwilling to leave her. She shifted again, this time slowly turning her body to face me more directly. A subtle movement, but it felt like it changed everything. The room felt smaller, the walls closer. My heart raced and I could feel the pulse in my neck. A growing heat that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. I tried to steady myself. I didn't want to acknowledge the sudden shift in the dynamic between us. She was my stepsister. This shouldn't have been happening. Yet here we were, trapped in a moment that felt completely out of our control. She broke the silence first. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was soft, almost guarded, but it didn't mask the tension. The question wasn't about me sneaking in. It was a challenge, an unspoken inquiry into why I hadn't left yet. I swallowed hard. The words stuck in my throat, tangled with the storm of thoughts that flashed through my head. I didn't mean to interrupt, I muttered, though it felt weak, like an excuse I wasn't sure I even believed. She raised an eyebrow, almost as if daring me to continue. The discomfort was palpable now, hanging between us like an invisible thread pulling tighter with every second. I could feel the shift in her posture too. Her shoulders tense, her legs shifting underneath her, like she was trying to decide whether to stay still or move. She didn't say anything else at first. Instead, she looked at me. Really looked at me, her gaze piercing through me in a way I couldn't ignore. It was strange, unsettling, like I was no longer just her stepbrother but something else, something different. The air between us crackled, thick with tension that neither of us could seem to escape. And despite the discomfort gnawing at me, there was something else I couldn't deny, a pull, an attraction I didn't want to feel. She broke the silence again, her voice quieter this time, almost a whisper. I didn't expect you to just stand there. Like that. Her words sent a jolt through me. My heart skipped a beat, and I had to fight to keep my breathing steady. I could feel it then, the space between us growing smaller, more intimate. My eyes flicked down to her hands, resting by her sides. I had never noticed how delicate her fingers looked before. They seemed almost out of place, soft and small in a room filled with the unspoken weight of everything we weren't supposed to be doing. I felt a sharp sting in my chest, an uncomfortable pull toward something I knew wasn't right, but couldn't look away from. My gaze flicked back up to her face, and for the first time I realized how much she'd changed. How much we had both changed. She wasn't the awkward, distant stepsister anymore. I could see the heat in her eyes now, the flicker of something deeper than just curiosity. She shifted again, the movement slow, deliberate, and for a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of vulnerability in her expression before she quickly masked it with a smirk. Her breath caught slightly as she leaned forward just an inch that made my pulse race. I could feel the heat radiating off of her, the magnetism of her presence pulling me in despite my every instinct to step back. The space between us felt charged, alive, and the air was thick with the unspoken. "Are you just going to stand there?" she repeated, her voice now laced with something else. Something I couldn't name, but it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Instead, my eyes fell to her lips just for a second. That 1 second felt like an eternity. The weight of her gaze, the tension in the room, it was overwhelming. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, louder than ever before. I forced myself to look away, to focus on anything but the proximity, but her presence filled the room, suffocating me. The heat in the air had grown too thick to ignore. I could feel her there, closer than before, like she was waiting for something, anything from me. Her breath was slow, controlled, but I could feel the unspoken words hanging between us. I took a step back, but she didn't move. Instead, she leaned in just slightly, her hand reaching out, fingers brushing lightly against mine. It was the gentlest of touches, but it ignited something deep inside me. The warmth of her hand lingered where hers met mine, and I felt a spark shoot through me, electric and undeniable. My body tensed, reacting before I could stop it, and in that moment I could have sworn I saw her smirk widen just a little. She was testing me. I wanted to pull away, to break the tension, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. Her touch lingered for a moment longer than I could handle, and then, just as quickly, she let go, her fingers retracting with the smallest of movements, leaving a void between us that felt heavier than ever. "Are you going to say something?" she asked, this time with a new sharpness in her voice, as if daring me to make the next move. I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. The tension between us had spiraled beyond anything I had expected. This was something else entirely. It wasn't just the forbidden, it was the pull, the undeniable chemistry, the question of what would happen next. And in that moment I couldn't tell which way I was supposed to turn. I never thought it would happen like this. I never thought the air would thicken to the point where every breath felt like it might snap in half. But there it was, that tension, that pull between us, too strong to ignore anymore. It was unbearable, suffocating, even like a force that was slowly breaking us both down, piece by piece. We were standing there, inches apart now, the space between us smaller than ever. Her eyes were locked on mine, and I could feel the weight of her gaze like a physical touch. Every single movement, every slight shift in the air, seemed to draw us closer. The words hung in the air unsaid, but there was nothing subtle about it anymore. She wasn't looking at me like a brother. She was looking at me like I was something else entirely. I could feel the heat radiating off of her, feel the raw desire in the way she held her body, the way her lips parted ever so slightly. I didn't know what I was waiting for, her to make a move? For me to walk away? But neither of us moved. We were both suspended in this moment, neither willing to break the silence. Then, without warning, it happened. She took a step forward, closing the gap between us, and before I could even think, she was there, so close I could feel her breath on my skin. I wanted to pull away to fight it, but there was no fight left in me. My body was betraying me. I could feel my heart racing in my chest, the adrenaline pumping through my veins, pushing me forward. Her hand reached out, and I could barely register the movement before her fingers brushed my arm. Just a gentle touch at first, but it was enough to ignite something inside me. The electricity between us crackled in that moment. My body was already responding before I had a chance to stop it. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. Her fingers lingered on my arm, and then without any warning, she tugged me closer. The next thing I knew, her lips were on mine, hungry, desperate, urgent. It was a kiss that felt like it had been building up for years. A kiss that I couldn't fight anymore, even though every part of me knew I should. My hands found her waist, pulling her even closer, as if I needed to feel the heat of her against me to confirm this was real. The kiss was raw. There was no finesse, no gentle exploration. It was all heat and need, a collision of two bodies that had been starved of touch for far too long. I could feel her breath, shallow and quick, against my lips as she pulled away slightly, her eyes dark with something I couldn't name. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The world around us seemed to disappear in that moment. The sounds of the house, the distant hum of the street, everything fell away, leaving just the two of us in this tiny, suffocating space. I could feel the pounding in my chest, a drumbeat that matched hers, and I realized we weren't just two people anymore. We were a singular force, a messy, complicated mess of raw emotion and need that we couldn't deny anymore. But as quickly as it had started, she pulled away, breaking the connection. Her breath was ragged now, her hands trembling slightly as she took a step back. I could see the confusion in her eyes, the mix of desire and fear, as she looked at me like she wasn't sure what to do next. Her lips were still swollen from the kiss, and I could see the flush creeping up her neck, the signs of what we'd just done already showing in the way her body was reacting. I wanted to say something, to apologize or make sense of it, but the words wouldn't come. How could I apologize for something that had felt so inevitable? How could I regret a moment that had felt so right, in a way that I couldn't explain? Her eyes darted away from mine, and for the first time I saw vulnerability there. She seemed to shrink in on herself, like she was trying to put some distance between us, but the tension, the weight of what had just happened, clung to the space between us like an unspoken promise. She ran a hand through her hair, her fingers trembling. What the hell was that? Her voice was shaky, but there was an edge to it. Not anger, fear, confusion, but I could hear something else there too. Something that sounded almost like regret. I didn't know how to answer. The words wouldn't form in my mouth. What was that? It was a mistake. It was a mistake that felt too real. It was a line crossed that we couldn't uncross. I should have walked away when I had the chance. I should have never walked into that room in the first place. But now that the moment had happened, I wasn't sure I wanted to go back. I didn't say anything. Instead, I reached out to her, my hand shaking as I touched her arm gently, not pulling her toward me but trying to convey something that words couldn't. Her eyes met mine, searching, as if she were trying to figure out if I regretted it too. Her lips parted, and for a moment I thought she was going to speak. Instead, she shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, like she was trying to push the moment away. We can't do this." But her voice cracked on the last word, and the hesitation in her eyes made it clear that she didn't really believe what she was saying. I could feel the pulse of desire still thrumming in my veins, could feel the heat in the room that hadn't gone away. Every inch of my body screamed for more, for the closeness, for the heat, but I knew better. This wasn't right. It wasn't supposed to be this way. I took a step back, but she didn't let me go far. She reached out, grabbing my wrist, and I could feel the electricity surge again at the contact. Her touch was insistent, not pleading but desperate, like she was afraid of what might happen if she let me walk away. "I don't know what this is," she whispered, her voice tight, but there was something raw in it. "But I don't want to lose you." I froze. I didn't know what to say, what to do. I could feel the weight of her words, the vulnerability in them, but it was too much, too fast, and I wasn't sure I could handle it. I took a deep breath, pulling away from her grip gently, trying to steady myself. We need to stop, I managed, my voice rough. But even as I said it, the moment lingered between us, the pull still there, undeniable. Neither of us could unfeel it, unsee it, or pretend it hadn't happened. The consequences were already written in the air, in the way we couldn't quite look away from each other, in the way the silence between us felt like it was about to break wide open again. I stood there, barely a breath between us, each heartbeat reverberating in my chest. The heat between us had escalated, suffocating any remaining restraint. Her eyes were locked on mine, but there was no confusion left in them, no hesitation. Only raw desire and a silent understanding. This moment wasn't something we could walk away from. There was no going back now. My chest tightened as I looked at her. I couldn't speak. I didn't need to. She stepped forward again, this time with a purpose. She reached up, her fingers brushing against my jawline, sending a shockwave of heat through me. Her touch was soft, but there was a fierceness in her eyes, a quiet demand that I couldn't refuse. The world around us felt like it had disappeared, like we were the only two people in it, caught in the gravity of this single moment. I can't keep pretending this isn't happening, she whispered, her voice low and trembling. Her hand slid down my chest, leaving a trail of heat in its wake. There was no turning back from this. The space between us was electric, charged with the unspoken truth we'd both been avoiding. I wanted to pull away. I should have. But my body wouldn't let me. I was trapped in the intensity of it, in the way her presence consumed me, in the way her touch left my skin burning for more. I had to have more. Before I knew it, I had pulled her into me, my hands gripping her hips as if they had a mind of their own. I could feel her breath, shallow and rapid, against my lips, and everything about this moment screamed to be consumed, to be devoured. I needed this, and I didn't care anymore if it was wrong. The kiss came crashing down, urgent and desperate. No more softness or uncertainty. Our lips collided with force, as if we were both trying to claim what we had been holding back for far too long. I could feel her body trembling against mine, but she didn't pull away. She kissed me back with just as much hunger, just as much desperation. Her hands were on my chest, pushing me back toward the bed, urging me to fall into it, to take this to where it had been building since that first accidental touch. The air was thick with heat, with something more primal now. We were no longer thinking, no longer fighting. It was pure instinct, pure need. She tugged at my shirt, pulling it over my head, and I didn't stop her. There was no more room for shame, for guilt, for second thoughts. She was on top of me now, her breath hot against my neck, her lips grazing the sensitive skin there, sending shivers down my spine. The way she moved, so sure, so bold, told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't pulling away anymore. Neither was I. I ran my hands up her back, feeling the curve of her body as she pressed herself closer to me. Her skin was soft, warm, and I couldn't stop myself from pulling her even closer, feeling the urgency in every movement. The tension had finally snapped, and in its place was something dark, something that felt both terrifying and thrilling. I kissed her again, harder this time, my hands roaming freely, tracing the lines of her body as if I couldn't get enough of her touch. The world outside of this room didn't matter anymore. There was only her, only us. Her hands were moving now too, pushing my pants down with a sense of purpose, a sense of urgency that mirrored my own. I could feel the raw desire in every touch, every movement. It was too much and yet not enough. She kissed me again, fiercely this time, as if we were both trying to erase everything that had come before. And when she pulled away, panting, her eyes dark with need, I knew there was no stopping it. No words were needed. The way she looked at me told me everything. This was happening. But even as the tension reached its peak, a flicker of doubt crept into my mind. The reality of what we were doing hit me like a cold splash of water. What had we just done? What had we crossed into? I saw the flicker in her eyes too. The moment was heavy with guilt, with fear of what might come next. But there was no time to process it. Her hands were back on me, urging me on, and I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. The moment was too consuming, too overpowering. We were lost in it now, lost in the rawness of what we had just unleashed. The world outside didn't exist anymore. It was just us, caught in this whirlwind with no escape. And then in a blink it was over. She collapsed beside me, her chest heaving, her skin flushed with the aftermath of everything we had just done. The air felt heavier now, like a weight had settled over both of us. The silence in the room was deafening, louder than any words could be. I turned to look at her, unsure of what to say. Her eyes were wide, still filled with the intensity of what had just happened. But there was something else there now. A look of fear? Regret? I couldn't quite read it. I couldn't bring myself to say anything. The weight of the moment felt too much. Too final. She didn't speak either. Instead, she rolled over, curling up into herself, as if trying to escape the vulnerability of what had just happened. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, every thought racing through my mind at once, but none of them making sense. What now? What was this? What had we done? There was no going back. There was no easy way out of this. The room felt colder now. The heat of the moment had evaporated, leaving only the remnants of what had been, what we had shared. The tension had shattered, but so had something else, something fragile that we could never put back together. We didn't speak. Not then. Not right away. There was nothing to say because we both knew this moment had changed everything. The consequences of what we'd done hung in the air like a fog, thick and suffocating. And all I could do was wait. Wait for her to say something. Wait for the fallout to come. But the worst part was the uncertainty. I couldn't tell if we had crossed a line we could never come back from, or if we just opened the door to something darker, something we couldn't put back in the box. And I didn't know if I was ready for either. The silence in the room was unbearable now, thick with the weight of what had just transpired. The adrenaline that had fueled our actions seemed to evaporate, leaving a hollow emptiness in its wake. I could still feel the heat of her skin on mine, the lingering traces of her touch, but now it only reminded me of the line we had crossed, a line that once seemed invisible but now felt like a jagged scar across everything between us. She lay beside me, her back to me, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, as if trying to regain control of her own thoughts. I couldn't help but watch her, wondering if she felt the same heavy cloud of guilt pressing down on her. The weight of what we had done seemed to settle around us, filling the room with a suffocating tension. I should have felt disgusted, ashamed. I had crossed a boundary I knew I shouldn't have. But there was something else lingering beneath the surface, something darker, something that called to me even now. I reached out, my hand hovering just above her shoulder, unsure of what to do next. Words seemed pointless. What could I say? I didn't even know if I wanted to hear her thoughts. Maybe it was better if we left it unspoken. But even then I couldn't shake the pull, the need to know what came after. She shifted slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of her face. Her eyes were closed, but her expression was far from peaceful. There was a heaviness there, a conflict in the way her brow furrowed. Was it regret? Or was it something else? Something darker? Her lips were parted slightly, but no words came. The question hung in the air between us. What now? Could we pretend this had never happened? Could we go back to the way things were before, when the tension was buried beneath the surface? Or was this the point of no return? I had no answers. My thoughts were a tangled mess of confusion, guilt, and something else that was far too dangerous to acknowledge. I didn't want to look at it, but I couldn't stop myself from wondering, what was next? Was this just a moment? A blip in time? Or was this the start of something more dangerous? Something that could never be undone? The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, a constant reminder that time was moving forward. I couldn't tell if the tension in the room was building, or if it had just settled into an unsettling stillness. We were caught in this suspended reality where nothing seemed real, but everything felt too real at the same time. I wanted to speak, to say something, anything to break the silence, but nothing came. What could I say that would make sense of this mess? Nothing would fix it. I could feel the distance growing between us, despite the closeness we had just shared. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure if we could ever get it back. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. We can't go back. The words were simple, but they carried so much weight, so much finality. She didn't need to say more. I knew exactly what she meant. Could I handle this? Could I live with the consequences of this? I didn't know. But I knew that the door had been opened. There was no closing it now. She turned toward me then, her eyes meeting mine for the first time since everything had happened. There was no judgment in her gaze, no shame, just an understanding, an unspoken agreement that this was something we had crossed into, and there was no turning back. But I wasn't sure if that was the hardest part or the easiest. For a moment I thought I saw something else in her eyes, something deeper, something that hinted at a question she wasn't asking. But it was gone before I could make sense of it. And then just as quickly the moment slipped away. She pulled the blanket up around her shoulders, curling up into herself, retreating into her own thoughts. I was left in the quiet of the room, the weight of everything we had done hanging in the air. I wanted to stay. I wanted to figure this out. But I also knew that nothing would be the same. Not for her. Not for me. I got up slowly, not wanting to disturb the fragile peace that had settled between us. I didn't look back as I left the room. There was no need. We both knew it. It was done. But whether that was the end or the beginning of something much darker, neither of us could say. The door closed behind me with a soft click. I paused in the hallway, my hand on the doorframe, as if waiting for something to change. But nothing did. The house was silent, the weight of the night hanging over me like a shadow. And as I turned to walk away, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. That this was only the beginning. Something new was brewing, something I couldn't control. And maybe that was the scariest part of all. The last image of the night was her face frozen in my mind. Her eyes distant yet knowing, full of an unspoken question. Would I ever be able to answer it? Would we ever speak of this again? The answer, I realized, was just as dangerous as the question. And that was the part one didn't know how to deal with.